Hey, I'm Rachel Billingsley.
And I'm Luke Billingsley, and this is GMT Talk, our insider podcast where we talk about all things GMT.
Today on GMT Talk, we will be interviewing Joe Chacon and Evan Yoak, the designer and developer of Decisive Action, which is now available for pre-order on P500.
Okay, let's get into it. We're talking about Decisive Action because that's the game that
yes,
we're
welcome,
on.
Joe and Evan.
Welcome.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks for being here. So let's start with what inspired you to make this game on modern tactical level combat between American and Russian forces?
You know, it kind of probably goes back to my roots in gaming. When I started gaming, I was a young high school kid, and this is in the late 70s. And, pardon me.
I love that ringtone.
Yeah, sorry. I really, at that time, the first game I latched onto was a platoon level modern tactical game, modern for the 70s, Mech War 77. And so I always had an interest in modern combat. It kind of drove me in a lot of respects to my career. Again, we're talking 1978, 1979. Heck, I was as far away from World War II at that point as we are to that time period, but it's still, it's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it. Still modern, and led me to choose to join the military and have a career in the military. And just by chance, my whole military career I spent really at the what we would consider the tactical level, maybe a little bit into the operational, but I worked at platoon, company, or squadron, battalion, that level for a long time. I worked at the brigade, the division level, corps level, and a little bit of JTF stuff. But for the most, all of that is considered really the kind of the tactical or a little operational. One of the assignments, I spent a lot of time with a battalion level units, watched about, I think, 18 of them go through and conduct training and how they fought. And it was really focused on what they did. And so that's that whole background that I carried with me as an armor officer and a military intelligence officer, and then the time I spent in the airborne community really led me to want to design this game. It kind of goes back to when I was watching units train in about 1993, 1994 is when I initially started thinking about a game at that point. And, over the course of the rest of my career and getting into designing games, it kind of led me to this point.
Okay, nice. And this is kind of fictional in a sense. There's no actual historical battles here, is that right? Or
no, there's not. But if you're in the Army, at least for Decisive Action, this first game of what I hope would be a series, you kind of live these fights every day when you go to any of the training environments that the Army does. So I took what I saw in those training environments and I built it so that I'm using authentic modern forces. I mean, it's an American Combined Arms Battalion. It's a Russian-based battalion tactical group, and they're going out and they're fighting in a hypothetical battles, because right now we're not fighting the Russians. And I think further in the series, I want to keep it that way. If I look and I get a chance to do another one, it'll be U.S. Marine Corps units with Australian maybe augmentation fighting against Chinese. I want to look and have a supplement with a NATO battle group, a NATO battalion one. Not conflicts that are actually going on now, but hypothetical ones. But We're using what they're doing in training today, whether it's at the National Training Center or it's in Germany or any of the training areas, and we're using that as kind of the setting that we're trying to set up. Of course, we are using actual terrain that we have on the ground. I've taken some terrain in Syria and adapted that to the potential battlefield. There's terrain that we're looking at for one of the maps in the Swiliki Gap of Lithuania, again, a potential battlefield. So it's not historically based. It's based on what we do these days to train in potential conflict areas.
Gotcha. That's really cool. It makes it a valuable resource, I'm sure, for a bunch of different military training groups and centers, and obviously for all of our customers who are interested in military history as well, to be able to kind of live out what it might look like today. So.
Yeah, I kind of, it makes me think back to those roots, when I got Mech War 77, it was I think published in 1975. it was potential battlefields, and it was not, that we had not fought the Russians at that point in Germany, but I got a game that allowed me to play that out. So that's what Decisive Action does, is it's a game that would allow you to play out those potential battles, particularly in this case, focus at the battalion level.
Yeah, as Joe was saying, near modern hypothetical is no longer World War III with the Soviets and the Fulda Gap. No, it's actual modern U.S. forces and Russian forces in the Fulda, or another gap as well. Yeah.
In the description of the game, it says this is not a classic card-driven game, but makes extensive use of the cards. So what else drives the game besides the cards? Maybe that's a dumb question, but
No, Rachel, I think it's great. I think back to some of the great designs by Mark Herman, like Paths of Glory, and all those that the cards allow you to do actions. In a sense, I think Decisive Action is more of a classic, tactical war game. Is you're going to move, you're going to shoot, you're going to roll the dice. The players decide all that, but the cards are used for a couple of different things. It's to keep track of information. So again, I'm a little bit older, gray beard at this point. I had a lifetime of wargaming. So having all of the information on a counter, like the firepower, the defense, and those kinds of things, it's really, there's a lot of utility to it. But at this point, it's hard to kind of digest all that on a battlefield of counters for me. So one of the sets of cards are all the information or the data for the units. So each counter is a platoon of tanks, and there's a card that corresponds with the combat system that tells you what the firepower is and the movement, the defensive value, those types of things. That's one set of cards that you have. So in this case, they're informational aids rather than driving it. Right. The other set of cards, an important part of the game, are the assets that you have. So it may or may not be a counter on the map, but you may have air support or attack helicopters or electronic warfare, the things that you want to deploy on the battlefield that aren't necessarily counters on the map or will only be there fleetingly. So those things are represented by cards as well that allows you to decide which ones you have available for your use and which ones you don't. Then there's some standard event cards that just help with the randomization. Initially, when I looked at that mechanic, each person could roll a die and consult a chart to see what the event was. Well, I would prefer to have all that information on a card and they randomly draw a card. And it's the same kind of effect for randomization. You just have it all on a card. Again, they're not driving the game. It's just a random event mechanic that we use the cards for. I think that kind of covers it. There might be there's a fourth set of cards, Evan?
The activation cards, the big one.
Oh, that's the other thing. Yeah, thanks. In that respect, there is a little bit of driven there, or driving the game, in that the different formations on the map, company level formations, it's a random activation for it. So I could have used chits, where you pull a chit and that represents the unit that gets activated. In this case, I used cards to do that. So again, you shuffle up a small deck of cards and you flip them over one at a time, and it tells you what unit is activated. But what the unit can do, or which units you can activate, or how you activate them, that's all normal war game, player driven.
Do you draw all of those activation cards in one turn or multiple turns? Like how can that affect the player as far as like you really need to move these units, but they're not? I didn't draw the card to activate.
Well, it's for me, it's a little bit of the fog of war aspect, or the chaos aspect of it. The first thing is for each formation, each company, there's 3, I think, separate cards that give you a certain set of actions that you can do. One of them, you're in kind of a move mode. One of them, you might be in a defensive mode, and one you're kind of in an attack mode. It's a decision for the player on what basically mission he's giving to that formation. Do I want that formation to move? Do I want him to attack? Do I want him to defend? That's the card that's allowed to be played for the turn. The fact that you take all those cards for both sides and you shuffle them up, you don't know who's going to go first. Am I going to get to move my company first, or which company am I going to get to move first, as opposed to the opponent? So the luck of the draw may come up, and you pull up and you move 3 of your units, 3 of your formations at once, and then it's the other player's turn, and you've kind of lost your ability to react a little bit. It's a little bit of the chaos of the battlefield. You can't, especially if you have a column of tanks, you might draw the column the unit that's second in column before the first, creating a traffic jam, because that's part of the chaos that you can't control in warfare or in training. So that's kind of what that random activation creates for the players.
Okay, I really like that. That's an interesting part of the game for sure.
Yeah, I used to say that the game was essentially chip pull, but then I'm talking now, I realize it's not. I mean, the fact that all the menu of options of what each formation can do is on the card rather than being, just unlimited, or you can do whatever. That distinguishes a lot from chip pull. I mean, I guess you could have chits with like tiny little writing on them, but the cards I think work really well for.
Kind of combines those two concepts. I think it's a little bit novel in some respects. I haven't run across a lot of games that do that, and they're just trying something new that I think should be interesting for players.
Yeah, definitely. That sounds cool. A couple of the articles and videos that are public already show how important planning is to the game. Can you tell us a little bit about the planning process and why it's so important, why in the real world and military training it's such an important part as well?
Sure. I think from what I've seen, one of the important aspects for a battalion commander and his staff is being able to manage not only the forces that they have assigned to them, their organic companies that are part of the battalion, but the force multipliers or the enablers that they get given or can request to help them be more lethal, more effective on the battlefield. So an infantry battalion or an armor battalion, they don't inherently have close air support. So that's an asset that they are given or they have to ask from a higher headquarters to provide to them. So the first thing is you kind of have to look at the battlefield and your mission within the context of decisive action and decide, what are the assets do I need? Do I want reinforcing artillery? Do I want electronic warfare? If you're a Russian player, do I want to use chemical weapons? Do I need close air support? Those things are assets that within the mechanics of the game, the player can receive or request. Once you have those, then you have to do some more looking at the game and decide when and where do I want to use them. More importantly, when. And you can decide throughout the game, I'm going to need those attack helicopters 1 hour into the battle, because by that time I've moved so far, I expect the enemy to move so far, we're going to be in contact. So that's part of the whole planning process. That's kind of regulated by the assets that are available to you. Those electronic warfare, attack helicopter, drones, all those kinds of things that you can request or be given to you. You have to do planning to use those things. So it's not just the player deciding he wants them. To kind of reflect what the staff can do, there's operations points that the staff has that they have to spend in order to buy those assets or to get them deployed on the battlefield. And that kind of takes up the idea of there's 2 or 3 staff officers that have to coordinate with somebody on the radio, or they have to talk to somebody, they have to talk to the aircraft, tell them where they need them to come, those kinds of things. That whole staff process and the planning that goes on is reflected by having operations points and spending those to commit assets. So that's to me, that's a big mechanic of the game. It's a big step in I think in tactical warfare, where you go from a squad, a platoon, a company, they can all go and fight by themselves. But when you get to a battalion, you have so much more available to you and you're coordinating so much more. That's kind of what I was really looking at focusing decisive action on, are those battalion level operations, coordination, planning, and execution. Evan's had a lot of experience with that, and we've gone through refining that system as we've gone through the development. I don't know if he wants to add anything onto that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'm a big fan of decisive action. I'm not biased at all. No, but I think I really like the planning aspect of the game in ways that a lot of war games just kind of let you, do what you want willy-nilly, and they don't kind of restrict you or reprimand you for, doing crazy stuff like, oh, I'm attacking in this direction, and you decide you're going to take that company and go all the way around the other side of the map and attack somewhere else. But instead of decisive action having very straitjacketing sorts of rules that say, no, you just can't do that, or you can only do these things, it lets you do those sorts of things, but it just kind of punishes you for it. So if Joe's talking about operations points, one of the things you can do with operations points is change your activation cards. So if you have a form, as he was saying before, cards that are more attack oriented, defense oriented, movement oriented. So if you want to change those, that usually, not always, but usually costs operations points. So that, you have a limited supply. So you have to make these decisions about when it's worth it to change those cards. And that's reflected if you start, going, and that's also in terms of the movement system and how that interacts with the cards. It makes it kind of more difficult to completely change your mind later. You can still do it, but it'll be more costly.
One of the things with that whole process I try to capture, and it's at least the way I play games, when you sit down with the scenario for any game and you look at it, particularly a tactical one, you kind of have to look at the map and you kind of say, okay, these are the places that the enemy can come, doing basically a terrain analysis.
Mhm.
This is where I can set my defense. Well, I think that we as war gamers do that inherently. If you play tactical war games, anytime you sit down to set up a defense, if you want to enjoy the game and be successful, you kind of think like that. Well, that's the same thing that happens at a battalion staff level with a whole staff of people looking at it. You have an intel officer that does the terrain analysis and will tell you which avenues the enemy can come. You've got a fire support officer that decides, where we want to put artillery targets. That same kind of thinking, I think most war gamers that enjoy tactical war games and play them do. And Decisive Action just kind of awards that kind of thinking, that kind of planning, the same way that a good battalion staff will do it.
And do you have to set all of your assets out on the time track at the beginning of the game, or are you allowed to do that during?
No. You can set some of them, and it's probably a good idea to do that if you do a little bit of that time distance analysis on when you want them. But you can keep some in reserve that you can decide that they're on call, and you can commit them later in the game. The problem is, in real life, if you did that, it takes a staff officer or some of the staff talking to the brigade headquarters, talking to the air defense unit to do that. So it takes some of that. We call it staff bandwidth. You're eating up some of that because now they're coordinating this on-call asset. In the game, that's reflected by, if you have an asset on call and you want to commit it later, it's going to cost you an operations point or two to do that. So again, you have a limited resource. It's a little bit of pressure on the players. Do I use my operations points to change those formation cards? That's in essence, somebody's calling a company commander and telling them, we're changing your mission from defense to attack. This is your avenue. These are your objectives, those kinds of things. It takes time and process in the battalion for the commander and the staff. So that's an operation point. Or if you need to commit an air asset that was on call, you have to do the coordination for that. That's operation points, those types of things. So it's kind of interwoven there. You have that ability. It gives you a little bit more flexibility, but it's going to cost you an operations point. It costs your staff, some effort to do that. And that's kind of reflected in Decisive Action.
Good. I like that.
I would add that most of the planning isn't required either. Like if you just want to go and, roll some dice and shoot some tanks, and, there's a little bit you have to do. I mean, it's like not, it's a war game. It's not like a non-zero intellectual endeavor, but you can kind of play it loosey-goosey and have a lot of fun too. Just that, if you want to play it well, you have to think ahead a little bit more than that.
So the game will punish you for not planning also, possibly.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So we've heard that Decisive Action is already being used by some military organizations for training, testing. Is there anything you could tell us about how that's been going?
Yeah, I don't think it's a secret. In fact, Mr. Barron wrote an article for us on Inside GMT. He stepped forward as a playtester for the game because, like any game, you want to make sure that it works. It's not just the designer or the developer. So we've had a lot of great playtesters. And Mr. Leo Barron, an author, I don't have the titles of any of these books here. I think I mentioned them in the intro on the Inside GMT article. Took the game and wanted to be a playtester and saw some utility in really what we were looking at for a battalion level planning and execution, and started to use it at the U.S. Army Military Intelligence Officers Transition Course. So in the Army, there'll be officers who serve as an infantry or an armor officer or some other branch as a lieutenant. And when they get to be a captain, they become military intelligence officers. And also, it's kind of, I mentioned, you're stepping from that world of being a platoon leader or being in a company to having to be on a battalion staff and be part of this whole process as a battalion staff officer, particularly as a military intelligence officer. So right now they're using Decisive Action in the playtest format to help train those officers, to expose them to battalion level planning and execution. So we really appreciate that. And we have gotten fantastic playtest feedback from them, because you have a whole lot of Army officers that are playing the game, giving us feedback on the mechanics and the rules and those kinds of things, so we can make them clear and easy. And at the same time, they're getting some great utility out of it and being exposed to what it's like to think about that planning and those types of things. I know that clearly that's being used in training. I think Evan got exposed to some other military gaming or war gaming personnel and their perception of decisive action. I mean, I don't know if you want to talk about that. What conference did you go to?
Yeah, I went to the Connections Wargaming Conference, which was a professional wargaming conference. Yeah, and I actually went and taught. I was on a panel and did a little talk about decisive action and how to use it for planning. Trying to get people excited, because I really do think I see a lot of value in it for that. And people were very interested in the game. They have their eyes on it.
I mean, I've been contacted by NATO and by the Australian Defence Force about it, and so there's a lot of professional interest out there in it as well.
Wow, that's really cool. I always love to hear when GMT games are being used by different military organizations for training and stuff. That's super cool. So obviously, making a modern tactical level game with Russians involved. Now we have, unfortunately, an ongoing conflict in Ukraine with Russians, and we can get a sense of what their modern combat is. Has that changed how you've approached designing the Russian player in Decisive Action? And if so, how?
I wouldn't say it's changed it. I think, based on when I started to design it in the literature, the professional military literature that was available to look at, was really focused on the new concept of a battalion tactical group and how that was organized and how they would fight. That's exactly what the Russians did when they went into the Ukraine, is they were organized and fought like that. So I felt good about how we have structured the Russians. And that also mirrors what the Army is doing. There's some open source available to the public information that the Army uses in their training. And that's really where I went to kind of draw the OB and the capabilities of the Russian forces that I put into Decisive Action. Although the Army, for reasons I think they call them the Atropians or the Denosvians or something like that, but it is modeled after the Russians. And so that's what I brought in. A couple of things from looking at the Ukraine. There's a lot of capabilities and lessons that I think that we have been watching, or I've been watching, that have drawn in. The drones are really important on the battlefield that we're seeing right now, at least in the Ukraine. So we've been able to take some of the capabilities that are being demonstrated using drones and make sure that they're in decisive action, because I think that'll be part of the next battlefield. And then that, there was some concern with performance and that kind of stuff. So I added in optional rules that take into account a little lesser Russian performance than what was initially perceived. And I had to look at that hard, and I spent a lot of time listening to what the Army was doing and how they're approaching that. And it's funny, I was listening to a panel a couple of years ago with a lot of the general officers at Fort Benning, the Maneuver Center of Excellence, in their panel. And that question actually came up to one of the U.S. officers that was on there. I think he was maybe the TRADOC commander or one of the other commanders. And the general officer kind of replied, and I think it was very true, is we're watching very closely what the Russians are doing and using that to model for our training. But quite frankly, if we're going to train to fight, we want to train to fight the Russians on their best day, not their worst. So when you play decisive action, you're getting the Russians on their best day, and it makes it a good competitive game.
That makes sense. Yeah, that's a really good plan.
One other mechanic that got changed. Originally, there were rules for concealment, concealment counters, and like a little shell game with like hidden fakes. But then Joe ended up taking that out because, for different reasons, but a big one being that, with unmanned aerial systems being so prevalent, that it seems unlikely that it's very difficult to hide on the battlefield.
Yeah, professionally now, the term they're using is that with the electronic warfare collection, all the drones, satellites, everything that we have, that it's a very transparent battlefield. It's no longer really as much of a mystery of what and where people are. It's just their ability to mass and bring effective fires against them. So that was easy then to pull that out of decisive action. It makes the game a lot less fiddly when you're playing it, because it's still a game, and that makes it easier and more fun to play, I think.
Okay, so what really brings both of you joy and excitement when you play or test the game? What about
the look on my opponent's face when they just lose an attack?
I think for me, it's putting you into the game. The last great game I played, I do a lot here soloing it, to make sure and play testing. But I was at Console World Expo this summer, And I sat down with Matt Kelly, really our premier playtester. The guy has been
He's great.
fantastic and with us. And if you've seen some of the videos he's done on the game, and Matt and I were able to sit down and play. And I was playing the Americans, and I set up a defense with my battalion, and he attacked with the whole Russian brigade. We had a great time, and it wasn't about the rules and mechanics. It was the role playing that we were getting into because we both Army officers, having both lived that and been on the battlefield. We were actually playing in the map for Hohenfels, Germany, an Army training area. We'd both been on the ground there, and we just had a great time, just enjoying reliving the fights that we had been there. So when an event card came up and an asset got canceled, and all of a sudden it was like, oh my God, higher headquarters just pulled my support. What am I going to do? It was that whole role playing that you can get into with it. And having lived that, it was nice to relive it with Matt. We had a great time doing that.
That's really cool.
Awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I would say for me, it's seeing how, well, one, I mean, the topic itself. So, near future hypothetical conflict is very interesting to me personally, but apart from that, it's just kind of seeing how all the systems fit together. There's something very satisfying about the game, and about you're trying to make things happen, and of course you have things go not your way, and bad die rolls, good die rolls, unlucky cards, whatever. But yeah, I couldn't say there's there's not necessarily one specific thing, but the way it all comes together and gels makes for very, very satisfying game experience. It's kind of not like anything I've played.
Especially having worked on it, I'm sure, being the developer too. Like, we finally got all the pieces to.
Yeah. Well, it was pretty far. It was pretty far along when I looked at it. Joe had most of it finished, but yeah, just the refinements for sure as well. But no, I think Joe's original creation is definitely still there. It has always had that element of kind of different subsystems working together, kind of to make a you constantly having to be making these little micro decisions about like, what do I do? But you're never really stuck, sitting there for 20 minutes, like, oh gosh, it's just like, where do I move this unit? I drew this card. What am I going to do this formation? That sort of thing. So it doesn't, you don't get bogged down, but you're constantly having to think, which is very fun.
Sorry about that. I should have turned the ringer off the first time. No one ever calls me, so it's kind of.
Isn't that always the way?
I'm like, who calls these days?
That's very true. It plays pretty quick, not time-wise, but like each turn kind of goes quick, or no analysis paralysis sort of stuff.
Yeah, not too much analysis. I'm not saying.
I guess you can make yourself.
I can get into analysis paralysis with bingo. Like, it doesn't have to be a complicated game. But yeah, in general, because there's always another activation card, so you're moving the formations pretty quickly. Each formation doesn't have.
It's also very interactive. It's not I go, you go. It's when I'm going, you probably ought to be watching, because you're going to have opportunity fire chances. You're going to have to react to what I do on a unit by unit basis. So it's very interactive that way to keep everybody engaged and moving. Like Evan said, there's a lot of subsystems that interact together that you're involved with constantly each turn as you go through, whether it's the artillery and the opportunity fire and the cards. Even when you flip over a card and you activate a unit, most of the companies only have 6 or 7 units, so you're finished moving that formation very quickly, or you can be. And because of the way the battle goes, you may flip over a card and your unit's in a defense, and the enemy hasn't shown himself yet, so you rapidly go on to the next one. So it can move pretty quickly.
Okay, great. Well, we talked about this a little bit already, but anything else that you would like to say about the future of the series, potential future of the series?
I'm really hoping that once we get Decisive Action, there's enough interest in the game that I can continue to design for it. I've got this great order battle, and I've already started to look at units and counters for a NATO battle group. And right now NATO deploys forces into the Baltics. They're enhanced battle groups, I think they're called, and they're composite units. So the last one I looked at, there was one that had a Canadian battalion commander. It had a Russian company. It had a Polish company. It had, they're composite units, and I'm thinking, well, what fun would it be to put that on the battlefield and fight? Because each company has a different weapon system, different capabilities. It would be really neat. So I would like to do a supplement at some point that includes just that battalion that you can then fight against the Russians that are in Decisive Action. I've already looked, and I was lucky enough to, with my work, spend some time at Camp Lejeune, the 2nd Marine Expeditionary Force, for an exercise that I was working with down there, and I talked to some Marines. So I'm already looking at building a complete second game that has a Marine battalion landing team, augmented probably with a coalition partner like the Australians, and fighting against some Chinese elements. Again, kind of if I use the same format, 4 maps. One of them might be one of the local train areas that the Marines always use, 29 Palms, something that's familiar for people, but then a beach area and an airfield area, and then have them go, how do the Marines approach those same attack and defense and those kinds of missions? So I think there's a lot of potential in there. I focused this game on armor forces. It's a combined arms battalion with Bradleys and M1 tanks, and the Russians have T-90s and BMPs. At some point it would be nice to put a Russian motorized battalion that's out there that has BTR-80s, or an American Stryker battalion that has wheeled Stryker units. So there's a lot of potential out there to grow this and to be able to match parts of it. So that's where I'm hoping it leads. Very much like GMT's Next Force series. You've got several games out there, and you have the supplements in between that would also allow us to update things as things are developed and get deployed to the battlefield. That's an opportunity for us to continue to update things. So That's where I hope it goes in the future. We have to get over this first big hurdle first, and that's get Decisive Action published.
That's right. Speaking of, I will put the link in the description of this interview if you want to pre-order it. It sounds really cool.
Pre-order it now.
No pressure.
Evan might be able to talk about it. I feel pretty comfortable where we're at with the design and the development. I was just recently going through and doing some editing in the rule book, but that's just wordsmithing it a little bit to make it a little bit clearer. The big thing is, we have an artist assigned, and we're starting to get the professional artwork. The stuff that I did is kind of, I like to say, is like 1970s SPI type artwork, so that we can get something out to play test. But Antonio is working great. He's done some great maps for us already, and we expect the other 2 to be done, and then we'll get on to the counters and the cards. So if we can get through the art phase here, I think we'll be in good shape.
We have a few final questions that we ask everyone we interview. So first of all, do you have a favorite game by another GMT designer?
Yeah, I told you I have to look at my shelf, at my shelves of GMT games. Yeah, the one that I find that I can also sit down and play, and I remember, oh, good grief, when was that at the Naval Postgraduate School? It was probably about 2001, 2002. I went to a convention from Monterey, California, up in San Francisco. I think it was Kubla Khan. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that. And I remember sitting down with Chad, and he explaining to me just the very beginnings of Combat Commander, and his and how he thought about it. And it was while we were sitting there, I think, all playing Advanced Squad Leader, and because he wanted to evolve kind of some of the concepts from Squad Leader, and that ended up being Combat Commander. And so I know that that's a game I can always grab, and with all the games that have been published and the supplements and everything else, there's a whole plethora of battles I can fight, and it's not something that I need to dive into the rules to get into again. So I've always enjoyed, because I knew him personally and I know Kai very well, and I can always get into a Combat Commander game.
That's a great choice. It's always my favorite GMT game too. So
do I have a spot? Oh
yeah,
yeah. Joe had to think. Now I have to think. I would probably say, keeping in the tradition of hypothetical near future conflicts, the Next War series, and then also Fields Fire. I haven't played it in a long time, but it's got a special place in my heart as a solo system.
Yeah, that's great. Both of those deserve some love on the podcast as people's favorite games, because I'm not sure, but I don't think anyone said Next War yet. So
okay,
that's right.
It's a good choice.
There we go. Yeah, gotta
Mitch will love hearing that.
He will. I'll have to send him the link. Here you go, Mitch.
Don't tell him I said that.
Don't tell him. That's fair. Okay. Well, last question. Who are a few people in the gaming hobby, if any, who have had a positive influence on your growth and development as a game designer, or in Evan's case, a developer?
I go up first. I can tell you without a doubt, it's Mark Herman. And unfortunately, I've only met him a couple of times personally. I haven't sat down to talk to him about game design professionally. But if you go back to the first games that I grew up and I loved, those SPI games, particularly Mech War 2 and some of the designs that Mark Herman has done, I really, although he's got a wide lens for designing games, it was the early work that he did on some of those modern tactical games that I think really influenced me tremendously.
Wow.
So when I look to designer in the mechanics and how he can integrate mechanics and the small micro decisions and those types of things, I spend a lot of time thinking, oh wait, I think I have Mark's new book over here next to me someplace.
Oh yeah. There it is.
I would say Mark Herman has been a big influence on the way I look at it. Now, actually, at some point, I hope that we're together and I have time to sit down and really let him dig into Decisive Action and tell me what he thinks and give me some of the feedback. That would be awesome.
Yeah.
Mark, your first, Mark.
Anytime.
I would say for me, from a development standpoint, I'd probably say, there's actually a lot of people at GMT who have been very helpful from design and development, just kind of thinking about games. But Joe Dewhurst, he kind of took me under his wing when I first started as a staff developer. So I started working on Decisive Action first, and then later came on as a staff developer for other games. And so I kind of shadowed him and watched how he did things and like the way he thinks through things and takes feedback, and it's just like very, very immediate about like, taking into account feedback when it's relevant and incorporating it and whatnot. And his approach to just being very thorough as well. It's very, very helpful to see.
Cool. Well, thank you guys for sharing that. We like to spread the love to people for how they've influenced us positively. So appreciate that.
Oh, shoot. I forgot to mention your dad.
Oh, well, that's fine. He'll be okay.
He knows.
They didn't want to hear that anyway, so bad.
That's fine. I'll send him this one clip, and then he'll be happy. So
Thanks for all the support, Gene.
Well, that's all the time we have for GMT Talk today. Thank you so much, Joe and Evan, for taking the time to come on and be our guests.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Thanks for this is awesome. Thank you for having us. It's always great to see you guys, and working with you, your dad, the whole GMT team is fantastic. Thank you for having me on.
Our pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's great.
Great. We will see everyone next time on GMT Talk.